Sarah Martinez stepped into the fluorescent-lit gym at 5:30 a.m., just like she had every morning for the past 18 months. The familiar scent of rubber mats and cleaning solution filled her nostrils as she surveyed the empty space. In a few hours, this place would be buzzing with the energy of her mixed martial arts students, but, for now, it belonged only to her and her memories. She walked toward the heavy bag hanging in the corner, her footsteps echoing in the silence. At 28, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and lived to tell about it, though she rarely spoke of those days. Her athletic frame moved with practiced efficiency as she began wrapping her hands, each movement automatic from years of repetition. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the small scar above her left eyebrow, a souvenir from her final mission in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Most people who met her now saw only Sarah, the gym owner, the patient instructor who helped soccer moms learn self-defense and taught teenagers discipline through martial arts. They had no idea that she had once been Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to complete the grueling training and serve in special operations. As she began her warm-up routine, stretching muscles that still remembered the weight of combat gear, Sarah's mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with her business partner, Mike, the night before. The gym was struggling financially, and they needed to attract more serious fighters to supplement their income from casual classes. Mike had suggested opening their doors to the local MMA training groups, allowing experienced fighters to use their facilities for a fee. Sarah had been hesitant. She'd built this place as a sanctuary, somewhere people could learn to defend themselves without the toxic masculinity and aggression that plagued many fighting gyms. But the bills wouldn't pay themselves, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing the one thing that had given her purpose after leaving the military. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts. Mike walked in, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing his usual optimistic smile. At 35, he was a former Marine who had found his calling as a fitness trainer after his own difficult transition to civilian life. He'd been Sarah's first friend when she'd moved to this small Colorado town, and the only person who knew the full story of why she'd left the Navy. "Morning, warrior princess," Mike said, using the nickname that had stuck from their early friendship. He handed her a coffee and settled onto a bench press nearby. "I know that look. You're overthinking again." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About opening up to other fighters." She paused, watching the steam rise from her cup. "I know we need the money, but this place means something to me, Mike. I don't want it to become just another testosterone factory." Mike nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "I get it, I really do. But we're not talking about turning this into some underground fight club. These are legitimate trainers and fighters who need space to practice. We maintain control of who comes in and how they conduct themselves." Before Sarah could respond, the morning's first student arrived. Jenny Chen, a 32-year-old accountant who had started training 6 months ago after a frightening encounter in a parking garage. She was followed quickly by Tom Bradley, a shy 16-year-old whose mother had signed him up after he'd been bullied at school. Then came Maria Santos with her 2 teenage daughters, all 3 learning self-defense together as a family bonding activity. As Sarah moved through the morning classes, demonstrating techniques and offering gentle corrections, she felt the familiar warmth that teaching brought her. This was what she'd built here, a community where people supported each other, where strength was measured not in how hard you could hit, but in how much you could overcome. During the lunch break, Mike approached her again. "Look, I made some calls this morning. There's a group called Thunder Valley MMA that's looking for training space. Their regular gym is being renovated for the next month. They're willing to pay premium rates, and I've done my homework on them. They're not some bunch of meatheads, they've got women fighters, they train for legitimate competitions, and their head coach has a reputation for running a clean operation." Sarah set down the towel she'd been using to clean equipment. "How much premium are we talking about?" "Enough to cover 3 months of rent and utilities," Mike said quietly. "Sarah, I know this is hard, but we're 2 weeks away from having to close this place down. The morning classes barely cover the basic costs, and we both know you're not taking a salary." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had poured everything into this gym, her savings from her military service, her hopes for the future, and more emotional energy than she cared to admit. The thought of watching it disappear felt like losing another piece of herself, something she wasn't sure she could survive. "All right," she said finally. "But I want to meet with their coach first. And I want it made clear that this is my gym, my rules. Anyone who can't respect that finds somewhere else to train." Mike's relief was visible. "I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. And, Sarah? You're doing the right thing. This place is too important to let it die because of pride." That evening, after the last student had left and Mike had gone home to his family, Sarah found herself alone in the gym again. She walked through the space she had created, running her fingers along the equipment she had carefully chosen. Everything here had been selected with purpose, the mats soft enough to cushion falls but firm enough for serious training, mirrors positioned to help students see their form without creating blind spots, lighting bright enough for safety but warm enough to feel welcoming. She paused in front of the small memorial wall she had created near the entrance. Photos of local first responders and military personnel who had been killed in the line of duty were arranged around a simple plaque that read, "In honor of those who serve." Her own service photo was noticeably absent, as was any mention of her background. Sarah had always preferred to let her actions speak louder than her credentials. As she stood there, memories began flooding back unbidden. The sand and heat of Afghanistan, the weight of responsibility that came with leading a team into hostile territory, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She remembered the day she had realized she couldn't do it anymore, not because she lacked courage, but because she had found something else that called to her just as strongly, the desire to help people find their own strength in a different way. The transition from military to civilian life had been harder than any mission she had ever undertaken. The structure and clear purpose that had defined her existence for nearly a decade were suddenly gone, replaced by an overwhelming array of choices and a society that didn't quite know what to do with women who had done what she had done. Some people put her on a pedestal, treating her like some kind of superhero, while others questioned whether women belonged in combat roles at all. But, here, in this gym, she had found something that felt like home again. Teaching gave her purpose, and watching her students grow gave her the same satisfaction she had once felt from successful missions. The scared accountant who could now walk confidently through a parking garage, the bullied teenager who had found his voice, the mother who was passing strength on to her daughters, these victories felt just as meaningful as any she had achieved in uniform. The sound of her phone buzzing interrupted her reverie. A text message from her sister in California saw the news about military budget cuts. "Hope you're doing okay out there. Call me soon?" Sarah smiled slightly. Her family still didn't quite understand her choice to leave the military or her decision to open a gym in a small mountain town where she knew no one. They worried about her isolation, not understanding that after years of intense teamwork and constant human contact, she craved the quieter connections she had built here. She locked up the gym and walked to her truck, a practical vehicle that bore none of the flashy modifications that seemed popular among the other military veterans in town. As she drove through the quiet streets toward her small apartment, she reflected on the decision she had made that day. Allowing other fighters into her space felt like opening a door she had deliberately kept closed, but perhaps it was time to trust that the foundation she had built here was strong enough to withstand some change. Her apartment was a reflection of her personality, clean, functional, and mostly devoid of personal decoration. The few photos on her shelves showed her with her family or her students, carefully edited versions of her life that omitted the years in uniform. She had learned early in her civilian life that her military background could overwhelm other aspects of her identity, and she preferred to be known for who she was now rather than who she had been. As she prepared a simple dinner, Sarah found herself thinking about the fighters who would soon be sharing her space. She wondered what their stories were, what had brought them to martial arts, and whether they would understand the culture of respect and mutual support she had worked so hard to create. The thought of conflict made her stomach tighten, but she reminded herself that she had faced far greater challenges than a few displaced fighters. Before bed, she did something she hadn't done in months. She pulled out a wooden box from the back of her closet and opened it carefully. Inside were her military commendations, photos from her service, and a letter of recommendation from her commanding officer that spoke of her exceptional leadership under extreme conditions and her unwavering commitment to the safety and success of her team. Looking at these mementos, Sarah felt a complex mix of pride and sadness. That woman in the photos seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders and had somehow found the strength to bear it. She wondered sometimes if that strength was still there, buried under the layers of civilian life she had carefully constructed. She closed the box and returned it to its hiding place, but the feelings it had stirred remained with her as she lay in bed that night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she would need to decide how much of her true self she was willing to reveal to maintain the sanctuary she had built. The question that echoed in her mind as she drifted off to sleep was one that had haunted her since leaving the military. In a world that no longer demanded everything from her, who was she supposed to be? The morning alarm came too early, as it always did, but Sarah was already awake when it sounded. She had spent much of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possible scenarios for the day ahead. In a few hours, she would meet the coach from Thunder Valley MMA and decide whether to open her carefully protected world to outsiders who might not understand or respect what she had built. As she went through her morning routine, Sarah caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something in her eyes that had been absent for a while, the sharp focus that had once helped her lead soldiers through dangerous missions. Whatever was coming, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had carried her through everything else. The question was no longer whether she was strong enough to handle whatever challenges arose, but whether she was ready to let others see exactly how strong she really was. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, right after Sarah's morning self-defense class for the local women's group. As she watched her regular students file out, chattering about weekend plans and sharing encouragement about their progress, she felt a protective surge that surprised her with its intensity. These people had trusted her with their safety and their growth, and she was about to allow strangers into their sacred space. Mike arrived early, carrying a folder of paperwork and wearing the expression he reserved for serious business discussions. "Coach Danny Reeves should be here any minute," he said, settling into one of the plastic chairs they used for parent observation. "I've been thinking about ground rules we should establish up front." Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened and a man in his mid-40s walked in, followed by a younger woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms. Danny Reeves was exactly what Sarah had expected from a successful MMA coach: stocky build, confident posture, and the kind of handshake that seemed designed to prove something. The woman with him, however, was a surprise. "Sarah Martinez?" Danny extended his hand with a broad smile. "Danny Reeves, Thunder Valley MMA. This is Rachel Kim, one of my top fighters and assistant coach. Thanks for agreeing to meet with us." Rachel stepped forward with a quieter confidence, her grip firm but not aggressive when she shook Sarah's hand. "Beautiful facility," she said, her eyes already assessing the layout and equipment. "Mike mentioned you've been running this place for about 2 years?" 18 months, Sarah corrected, noting how Rachel's gaze lingered on the memorial wall. "I opened it after I moved to town." "What exactly are you looking for in terms of training space?" Danny launched into what was clearly a prepared pitch. "Our regular gym is completely gutted right now, water damage from a burst pipe. Then, the insurance company decided it was a good time to upgrade everything. We're looking at 4 to 6 weeks before we can move back in. We've got 12 serious fighters who train 6 days a week, plus my coaching staff. We're willing to work around your regular class schedule and pay premium rates for off-peak hours." As Danny talked, Sarah found herself watching Rachel, who had wandered over to examine their heavy bags. The young woman moved with the fluid precision of someone completely comfortable in her own body, testing the weight and feel of the equipment with professional interest. When she caught Sarah observing her, Rachel offered a small smile that seemed genuine rather than the practiced charm Danny was deploying. "What kind of fighting backgrounds do your people have?" Sarah asked, interrupting Danny's explanation of their typical training routine. "Mixed bag," Danny replied. "Rachel here is a former collegiate wrestler who's moved into MMA. We've got a couple guys who came up through boxing, some with jiu-jitsu backgrounds, one former kickboxer. All legitimate competitors, no street fighters or wannabe tough guys." Rachel rejoined the group, having completed her assessment of the facility. "Your setup is really thoughtful," she said to Sarah. "Most gyms just throw equipment wherever it fits, but you've actually created different zones for different types of training. Have you coached professionally before?"
The question hung in the air for a moment. Sarah felt Mike's eyes on her, knowing he was wondering how much she would reveal.
"I've had some experience with training," she said carefully. "What matters to me is that everyone who uses this space respects it and each other.
This isn't a place for ego trips or showing off."
"Completely understand," Danny said quickly. "Look, I'll be straight with you, we need this arrangement more than you need us.
Our people are getting restless training in a church basement with borrowed equipment. We're willing to follow whatever rules you set." Sarah walked over to the windows that looked out onto the small parking lot.
A few of her afternoon students were arriving early, including Tom Bradley with his mother. The teenager had grown 3 inches since starting training with her, and his posture had straightened with his confidence. She watched him hold the door for his mother and felt again that protective instinct. "I want to meet all of your fighters before they set foot in here," she said finally, turning back to face Danny and Rachel.
"Not just names on a roster.
I want to sit down with each of them and make sure they understand what this place is about."
Danny's smile faltered slightly. "That seems a little excessive. These are professional athletes, not troublemakers." "Professional athletes can be the worst troublemakers," Sarah replied evenly.
"I've seen what happens when skilled fighters think rules don't apply to them.
My gym, my requirements." Rachel stepped forward before Danny could respond. "I think that's completely reasonable," she said, shooting a warning glance at her coach. "Sarah's protecting something she's built from scratch. I'd want to do the same thing."
She turned to Sarah.
"Would it help if I brought them in small groups? Maybe 3 or 4 at a time, so it's not overwhelming for anyone?"
Sarah found herself appreciating Rachel's diplomatic intervention.
"That could work. When would you want to start?"
"Our lease on the church basement runs out Friday," Danny said.
"Could we start bringing people by tomorrow afternoon?" "Tomorrow's too soon," Sarah said immediately.
"I need time to prepare my regular students for the change."
"How about we start Monday? That gives me the weekend to have conversations with my people." Mike cleared his throat.
"Sarah, I hate to push, but we talked about this.
The financial situation."
"I know about the financial situation," Sarah said, her voice carrying just enough edge to remind everyone that she was in charge here. "But I won't sacrifice everything I've built for the sake of a few extra weeks."
"Monday morning, first group of 4 fighters. We'll see how it goes from there."
Danny looked like he wanted to argue, but Rachel placed a subtle hand on his arm.
"Monday morning works fine," she said. "What time is good for you?"
10 o'clock. After my seniors class and before the homeschool group comes in. Sarah found herself warming to Rachel despite her reservations about the arrangement.
"And I want you there for the first meeting. Danny too. I want to see how your people interact with their coaches." After Danny and Rachel left, promising to send over a list of fighters and their backgrounds, Sarah sank into one of the observation chairs.
Mike sat down beside her, both of them staring out at the now busy gym where the afternoon classes were beginning.
"You sure about this?" Mike asked quietly. "No," Sarah admitted. "But you're right about the money.
And maybe it's time I stopped being so protective of this place."
"That's not necessarily a bad thing, being protective.
This place is special because you care about it so much." Sarah watched Jenny Chen working with one of the newer students, patiently demonstrating a basic wrist escape. 6 months ago, Jenny had barely been able to make eye contact with strangers. Now she was teaching others, paying forward the confidence she had gained here. That was what Sarah was really protecting, not just a business, but a community.
"I keep thinking about something my commanding officer told me once," Sarah said.
"He said the mark of a good leader isn't keeping your people safe from all challenges, but preparing them to handle whatever comes their way."
Mike nodded slowly. "You think your students need to see how you handle this situation?" "Maybe. Or maybe I need to remember that I can handle it." Sarah stood up, feeling some of her tension ease. Either way, Monday should be interesting.
The weekend passed quickly as Sarah had individual conversations with her regular students about the upcoming changes. She was surprised by their reactions. Rather than concern, most expressed curiosity about the new fighters and confidence in Sarah's ability to maintain the gym's welcoming atmosphere. Tom Bradley was particularly enthusiastic, asking if he might be able to learn some techniques from the more advanced fighters.
"You're not giving us enough credit," Jenny Chen said during Saturday's women's class. "We know this place is special because of what you've created here. A few new faces aren't going to change that."
Sunday evening found Sarah at the gym again, supposedly doing paperwork but actually just sitting in the quiet space and trying to calm her nerves. She had faced enemy fire without this level of anxiety, but somehow the thought of potentially losing control of her carefully crafted environment felt more threatening than any physical danger. The sound of knocking on the front door interrupted her brooding. Through the glass, she could see Rachel Kim standing outside, wearing casual clothes and holding what appeared to be a coffee cup.
Sarah hesitated for a moment before opening the door.
"I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Rachel said. "I was driving past and saw the lights on.
I brought you this."
She held out the coffee cup, which turned out to be tea.
"Green tea with honey. Figured you might be a little wound up about tomorrow."
Sarah accepted the cup, surprised by the thoughtful gesture.
"You could say that. Want to come in for a minute?"
Rachel followed her into the gym, moving with the same quiet assessment she had shown during the meeting.
"I know Danny can come on a little strong," she said as they settled into the observation chairs.
"He's a good coach, but he's not always great at reading situations. I wanted you to know that most of our fighters aren't like that."
"What are they like?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious.
"Dedicated. A little obsessed with getting better. Most of them work regular jobs during the day. We've got a nurse, a teacher, a guy who works construction. They train because they love it, not because they're trying to prove something to the world."
Sarah sipped her tea, finding the honey soothing. "And you? What's your story?"
Rachel was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider how much to share. "I started wrestling in high school because I was angry about a lot of things and needed somewhere to put that energy.
Turned out I was good at it.
Got a scholarship to college, did well there, but when I graduated I felt lost.
MMA gave me something to focus on again." "What were you angry about?"
"My dad walked out when I was 12. Left my mom with 3 kids and a mountain of debt. I spent a lot of years being pissed off at him, at the world, at myself for not being enough to make him stay." Rachel's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the old pain underneath.
"Wrestling taught me that anger could be useful if I channeled it right. Fighting taught me that it didn't have to define me." Sarah felt an unexpected kinship with this young woman. "How long have you been with Thunder Valley?"
3 years.
"Danny took me on when I was pretty rough around the edges. He's actually the one who taught me that being tough doesn't mean being an ass to everyone around you."
Rachel smiled slightly.
"Took me a while to learn that lesson."
They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both women lost in their own thoughts.
Finally, Rachel spoke again. "I know this is hard for you, letting us into your space. I can see how much this place means to you. I just want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make sure my teammates respect that." "Why?" Sarah asked. "You don't owe me anything." Rachel considered the question seriously.
"Because places like this are rare. Most gyms are about competition, about proving you're stronger or tougher than the next person. But when I walked in here yesterday, I could feel something different."
"Your students trust you completely. That doesn't happen by accident."
After Rachel left, Sarah found herself feeling cautiously optimistic about Monday morning. She had been so focused on protecting her students from potential disruption that she hadn't considered the possibility that the new fighters might actually fit into the community she had built. Rachel certainly seemed to understand what made this place special. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's nervous energy. Her seniors class went smoothly, with the usual group of early retirees and empty nesters who trained with her 3 times a week. As they were leaving, several stopped to wish her luck with the new arrangement, their confidence in her ability to handle the situation both touching and intimidating. At exactly 10 o'clock, Rachel arrived with 3 other fighters in tow. She introduced them as Marcus Thompson, a soft-spoken construction worker in his 30s, Lisa Park, a pediatric nurse who looked like she could barely hurt a fly, and Jake Sullivan, a high school math teacher whose nervous energy reminded Sarah of Tom Bradley on his first day. "Welcome to Mountain View Martial Arts," Sarah said, leading them to the seating area. "I know this is probably unusual, having to interview just to train somewhere, but I wanted to take a few minutes to explain what we're about here." She found herself relaxing as she talked about the gym's philosophy and the community they had built. The 3 fighters listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about the schedule and the mix of students they would be training alongside. Marcus mentioned that he had a daughter in college who had taken self-defense classes, and he appreciated that Sarah offered family-friendly programs. Lisa talked about the stress of her job and how training helped her decompress in a healthy way.
"Any questions about what I've told you?" Sarah asked as the conversation wound down. Jake raised his hand tentatively. "This might sound weird, but would it be okay if I observed one of your regular classes sometime? I teach kids all day, and I'm always looking for new ways to help them build confidence. The way you described working with your students sounds like something I could learn from." Sarah felt her last bit of tension ease. "That would be fine. I think you'll find that teaching martial arts and teaching math have more in common than you might expect." As the group prepared to leave, Rachel lingered behind. "Thursday afternoon we'll bring the next group. Is that still good for you?" "Thursday's perfect." Sarah paused, then added, "Thank you for bringing people who get it." "Thank you for giving us a chance," Rachel replied. "See you Wednesday morning for our first training session?" "I'll be here," Sarah said, and, for the first time since this whole arrangement had been proposed, she found herself actually looking forward to it. That afternoon, as Sarah taught her homeschool group, she reflected on how wrong her assumptions had been. She had been so focused on protecting her space from invasion that she had forgotten one of the most important lessons from her military service: sometimes the best way to strengthen your position was to welcome the right allies. These fighters weren't invaders, they were potential additions to the community she had spent 18 months building. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt genuinely excited about the future of her gym. The financial pressure was easing, but, more importantly, she was remembering that growth didn't have to mean compromise. Sometimes it just meant trusting that the foundation you had built was strong enough to support something bigger. Wednesday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had everyone in town talking about climate change and unusual weather patterns. Sarah found herself at the gym an hour earlier than usual, ostensibly to prepare for the Thunder Valley Fighters' first training session, but really because she was too restless to stay in her apartment any longer. The first group would arrive at 11, after her regular morning classes but before the lunch crowd. She had deliberately scheduled it this way to minimize interaction until everyone had a chance to settle into a routine. As she moved through her usual preparation ritual, checking equipment and adjusting the ventilation system, Sarah reflected on how much her attitude had shifted since meeting Marcus, Lisa, and Jake. Mike arrived at his usual time, carrying coffee and wearing a satisfied expression. "You look less like you're preparing for battle this morning," he observed, settling into his preferred spot on the bench press. "Maybe because I'm not," Sarah admitted. "Monday's meeting went better than I expected. These people actually seem to understand what we're trying to do here. That's a relief. Danny called me yesterday to confirm the payment schedule. Did I mention he's paying 2 weeks in advance?" Sarah paused in her equipment check. The financial relief was significant, but she found herself more interested in the human element than the business aspect. "How many people are we expecting today?" Rachel said 6 fighters, plus Danny to observe. "They'll use the back section where you've got the ring set up, and they promise to be out by 1 so you have time to reset before the kids' program." At precisely 11 o'clock, the front door opened and Rachel walked in leading a group that looked like they could have been pulled from any office building or suburban neighborhood. Gone were Sarah's preconceptions about intimidating fighters covered in tattoos and radiating aggression. These were ordinary people who happened to be extremely good at hitting things. Marcus she recognized from Monday, but the others were new faces. Rachel performed introductions with the efficiency of someone comfortable with leadership.
There was Angela Rodriguez, a social worker who looked like she should be helping children rather than training to fight them. Kevin Chen, no relation to Jenny, worked as an accountant and had started fighting to overcome social anxiety. The biggest surprise was David Kim, a man in his early 50s who had begun training 2 years ago after his doctor told him he needed to find a more engaging form of exercise than walking on a treadmill.
Sarah owns this place, Rachel explained to the group.
She's also an instructor, so if you have questions about equipment or anything else, she's the person to ask. Danny had positioned himself near the memorial wall, his earlier pushy demeanor replaced by something more respectful. Sarah caught him studying the photos of fallen first responders and felt a grudging appreciation for his quieter approach today. "We'll start with a warm-up and then work through some ground techniques," Rachel announced, moving toward the mated area.
"Remember, we're guests here, so everything stays controlled and professional."
Sarah had intended to work on administrative tasks in her office, but found herself watching the group's dynamics as they began their training. What she observed surprised her. Rather than the aggressive posturing she had expected, the fighters moved with a technical precision that reminded her of her own military training. They were clearly taking Rachel's instructions about being guests seriously. When Angela Rodriguez attempted a difficult submission technique and struggled with the execution, instead of mocking her or showing off, Kevin Chen immediately offered suggestions for adjusting her grip. When David Kim needed a break due to his age, no one made him feel self-conscious about it. This was a group of people who genuinely supported each other's growth.
"Not what you expected, huh?" Mike appeared beside her, following her gaze toward the training session.
"No," Sarah said quietly. "I keep waiting for someone to start acting like a stereotypical fighter, but they're all just normal people trying to get better at something they love." The training session progressed smoothly for about 40 minutes. Rachel rotated the group through different techniques, offering individual feedback and ensuring everyone had opportunities to work with different partners. Sarah found herself appreciating the young woman's coaching style, which emphasized precision and safety over power and aggression. Then, two things happened almost simultaneously that would change everything. Jenny Chen arrived for her usual lunch hour private lesson, 15 minutes early as was her habit. At the same moment, the front door opened again and 3 men walked in who clearly were not part of the Thunder Valley group. Sarah felt her internal alert system activate immediately. These were not people who belonged in her carefully maintained environment. The leader of the 3 newcomers was tall and heavily muscled, with the kind of aggressive posture that screamed trouble. His companions flanked him with obvious intent, their eyes already assessing the room like they were looking for weaknesses. Sarah recognized the type immediately from her military days, men who used their physical presence to intimidate others and had never learned that real strength didn't require constant demonstration. "Excuse me," Sarah said, stepping forward to intercept the group before they could advance further into the gym.
"Can I help you with something?"
The leader looked her up and down with unconcealed dismissal.
"Yeah, we heard you got some fighters training here now. Came to check out the competition."
Behind her, Sarah could sense the Thunder Valley group had stopped their training and were paying attention to the situation. She could feel Rachel's eyes on her, but she didn't turn around. Everything about these 3 men suggested they were looking for trouble, and Sarah's protective instincts were now fully engaged. "This is a private training facility," she said evenly. "If you're interested in classes, we can schedule a consultation during regular business hours."
The leader laughed, a sound with no humor in it.
"Classes? Lady, we're not here for some soccer mom self-defense course. We heard you got some real fighters here, and we want to see what they're made of." Sarah felt her muscles tense in a way they hadn't in months. This was exactly the scenario she had feared when Mike first proposed opening the gym to outside fighters. These men weren't here to train or learn, they were here to prove something, and that made them dangerous to everyone in the building. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that Mike would have recognized from their early friendship when she had handled other troublemakers.
"This isn't the kind of place you're looking for. Who the hell are you to tell us to leave?"
The leader stepped closer, now clearly attempting to intimidate her with his size.
"You just some instructor here, or do you actually know how to fight?"
Behind her, Sarah heard movement as the Thunder Valley fighters began positioning themselves. She caught a glimpse of Danny stepping protectively near Jenny Chen, who had frozen near the entrance. The whole situation was escalating exactly as Sarah had feared it might. "I'm the owner of this facility," Sarah said, standing her ground despite the man being nearly a foot taller than her. "And I'm telling you that you need to leave. Now." The leader's expression shifted to something uglier. "Owner, huh? Well, maybe it's time someone showed you that you're not as tough as you think you are. How about we have a little sparring match? You and me, right here. Let's see what kind of fighter you really are." The gym went completely silent. Sarah could feel the attention of everyone present focused on this moment, waiting to see how she would respond. Part of her mind was calculating tactical options. The man was bigger and, probably stronger, but his stance and movement suggested he relied more on intimidation than actual skill. More importantly, she could sense that this confrontation was about more than just her. These men were challenging everything she had built here, threatening the safe space she had created for people like Jenny and Tom and all the others who trusted her to protect them. "I don't think that's necessary," Rachel's voice cut through the tension as she stepped forward. "But, if you're looking for some sparring, I'd be happy to accommodate you." Sarah felt a surge of appreciation for Rachel's attempt to defuse the situation, but also a protective instinct toward the younger woman. These weren't the kind of men who would show restraint against a female opponent, regardless of her skill level. "I wasn't talking to you, sweetheart," the leader said dismissively. "I want to see what the boss lady here is made of." That was the moment Sarah made her decision. Not because she felt the need to prove anything to these men, but because she realized that everyone in this gym, her students, the Thunder Valley fighters, even Mike, needed to see that she was capable of protecting the community she had built. More than that, she needed to remember it herself. "All right," she said quietly, beginning to remove her outer shirt to reveal the athletic tank top underneath. "But we do this properly. Mat time, 3-minute rounds, and, when it's over, you leave and don't come back." The leader's grin was nasty with anticipation. "Fair enough. Hope you got good insurance on this place." As Sarah began wrapping her hands, she felt something she hadn't experienced in almost 3 years, the cold, focused calm that had carried her through combat situations. Her mind was already analyzing her opponent's likely strategy and formulating her response. This wasn't about proving she was tough or satisfying her own ego. This was about protecting her people and preserving the sanctuary she had built. Danny approached her quietly as she finished preparing. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. We can call the police, have them removed for trespassing." "No," Sarah said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "This ends here, today. Otherwise they'll keep coming back, and next time might be when I'm not here to handle it." What none of them knew, including Mike, was that Sarah hadn't simply been a Navy SEAL, she had been one of the most decorated female fighters in the special operations community. Her hand-to-hand combat training had been extensive and brutal, designed for situations where failure meant death. She had hoped never to use those skills again, but sometimes the past demanded to be remembered. As she stepped onto the mat, Sarah caught sight of Jenny Chen's frightened face near the doorway. Tom Bradley had arrived for his after-school session and was standing frozen beside his mother. These were the people she was really fighting for, not to prove her own strength, but to preserve their safe haven. The leader stepped onto the mat with obvious confidence, rolling his shoulders and cracking his neck like he was preparing for a workout rather than a real fight. His companions had positioned themselves where they could see everything, their anticipation palpable. They expected to watch their friend humiliate a small-town gym owner, probably planned to record it for social media bragging rights. What they didn't expect was to witness the return of Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL, who had once been described in her military records as exceptionally skilled in close-quarters combat with a tactical mind that excels under pressure. The transformation was subtle but complete. Sarah's posture shifted from defensive to predatory, her movements becoming fluid and purposeful in a way that made Rachel's eyes widen with recognition. This wasn't the patient instructor who taught self-defense to accountants and teenagers. This was someone else entirely. "Last chance to walk away," Sarah said quietly, settling into a fighting stance that looked deceptively casual. The leader laughed and lunged forward with a wild swing that telegraphed his intention from 3 feet away. Sarah moved like water, slipping the punch and responding with a precise combination that dropped him to the mat in under 5 seconds. The gym erupted in shocked silence as the man struggled to his feet, his nose bleeding and his confidence visibly shaken. "What the hell?" he gasped, wiping blood from his face.
Sarah didn't respond, didn't celebrate, didn't show any emotion at all.
She simply reset her stance and waited. The cold efficiency of her response had transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. This was no longer a bully trying to intimidate a small business owner. This was a predator who had badly miscalculated his prey. The leader's friends were no longer looking excited about the entertainment. They were looking at Sarah with something approaching fear, beginning to understand that their friend had picked a fight he was in no way prepared to win. But pride and stupidity make dangerous companions. Instead of accepting defeat and leaving with whatever dignity he had left, the leader made the worst possible choice.
He charged again, this time with real anger behind his attack. What followed was a systematic demonstration of exactly why certain people should never be underestimated.
Sarah didn't just beat him, she dismantled him with the kind of technical precision that could only come from years of training in situations where second place meant death. Every movement was economical, every strike purposeful, every defense perfectly timed. When it was over less than 2 minutes later, the man lay on the mat breathing heavily and staring at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. His friends were backing toward the door, suddenly, eager to be anywhere else. Sarah stood over him, not even breathing hard, and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions.
"You and your friends are going to leave now. You're never coming back.
If I see you anywhere near my students or my gym again, what just happened will seem gentle by comparison.
Are we clear?"
The man nodded weakly, accepting help from his friends to stand and stumble toward the exit. As the door closed behind them, the gym remained silent except for the sound of Sarah unwrapping her hands with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the fight. It was Jenny Chin who finally broke the silence, her voice filled with awe.
"Sarah? Where did you learn to do that?"
Sarah looked around at the faces staring at her, her regular students, the Thunder Valley fighters, Mike with his knowing smile, and Rachel with something that looked like respect and curiosity in her eyes. The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized that the time for hiding who she really was had come to an end. "It's a long story," she said finally, beginning to understand that her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to give way to something more complete, more honest, and potentially more powerful than anything she had built before. The sanctuary she had created was still intact, but it was no longer a place where she had to pretend to be less than she really was. And, somehow, that felt like the most important victory of all. The silence that followed Jenny's question stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds. Sarah looked around the room at faces filled with curiosity, concern, and, in Rachel's case, dawning recognition. She had spent 3 years carefully constructing a civilian identity that allowed her to help others without the weight of her military background overwhelming every interaction. Now, in the space of 5 minutes, that carefully maintained separation had crumbled completely. Mike stepped forward, his expression gentle but knowing.
"Sarah, you don't owe anyone explanations you're not ready to give."
But, as Sarah looked at Jenny Chan's odd expression, at Tom Bradley's wide-eyed stare from the doorway where he stood with his mother, at the Thunder Valley fighters who had just witnessed something that probably challenged everything they thought they knew about fighting, she realized that maybe explanations weren't about what she owed others. Maybe they were about what she owed herself. "Before I moved here and opened this gym," Sarah said finally, her voice steady but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "I served in the Navy for 8 years. The last 4 of those were with the SEALs."
The reactions around the room varied dramatically.
Jenny's hand flew to her mouth in surprise.
Tom's mother looked like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about her son's instructor.
Several of the Thunder Valley fighters exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand why Sarah had moved with such lethal efficiency. But it was Rachel who spoke first, her voice filled with respect rather than surprise.
"That explains a lot about how you carry yourself.
And why you were so protective of this space."
"Does it?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Rachel's perspective.
The way you positioned yourself when those guys came in, how you managed the threat assessment, the fact that you ended that fight so quickly it barely registered as a fight at all. Rachel paused, seeming to choose her words carefully.
My brother's a Marine.
I've seen how military training changes someone, but I've never seen anyone transition from civilian mode to combat mode that seamlessly. Sarah felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For 3 years, she had lived with the fear that revealing her background would change how people saw her, would make them treat her like some kind of weapon rather than a person.
But the faces looking at her now showed curiosity and respect, not fear. Why didn't you tell us?
Jenny asked, her voice soft with what sounded like hurt. All this time, we thought you were just naturally good at teaching self-defense. Because I wanted you to see me as Sarah the instructor, not Sarah the former SEAL, Sarah replied honestly. I wanted to build something here based on who I am now, not who I used to be. Danny, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke up.
With all due respect, it seems like maybe those aren't two different people. Maybe they're the same person with different aspects. His observation hit closer to home than Sarah was comfortable admitting.
For 3 years, she had been trying to separate her military self from her civilian self, as if the skills and experiences that had defined her for nearly a decade could be compartmentalized and filed away. But watching those men threaten her students and her sanctuary had brought everything flooding back, not as unwelcome intrusion but as natural response.
Can you tell us about it?
Tom Bradley asked, his teenage voice cracking slightly with excitement and nervousness.
About being a SEAL?
Sarah looked at the young man who had grown so much in confidence since starting training with her. His mother was watching the interaction carefully, probably weighing whether having a former special operations soldier as her son's instructor was reassuring or concerning.
Some of it, Sarah said carefully.
The parts that might help you understand why I teach the way I do, and why places like this matter so much. She moved to the center of the mat where the confrontation had taken place just minutes before, and everyone instinctively gathered around her in a circle. It reminded her of briefings in Afghanistan, soldiers sitting in the dust listening to mission parameters, except these were suburban families and dedicated fighters seeking understanding rather than tactical information. The military teaches you a lot of things, Sarah began, settling cross-legged on the mat. How to fight, obviously, but, more importantly, how to think under pressure.
How to assess threats and respond appropriately.
How to work as part of a team where everyone's safety depends on everyone else doing their job correctly. She paused, looking around at her audience. But, the most important thing it taught me was that real strength isn't about how hard you can hit or how tough you can act. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves, and building something worth protecting. Jenny raised her hand tentatively.
Is that why you opened the gym? Because of something that happened when you were deployed? Sarah considered the question, weighing how much of her story she was ready to share.
The truth was that her decision to leave the military and open a civilian gym was connected to a specific incident in Afghanistan, but it wasn't a story she had ever told in full to anyone except Mike. Partly, she said finally. I realized that the skills I had learned could be used to help people in a different way. Not just preparing soldiers for combat, but teaching regular people how to be safe and confident in their daily lives. Rachel leaned forward, her professional interest clearly engaged.
How much of what you just did back there was SEAL training versus natural ability?
All of it was training, Sarah replied. But not just military training. Everything I learned in the SEALs, everything I've learned since then, from teaching here, working with different people, understanding what real self-defense means for people who aren't professional fighters. She stood up, moving to one of the heavy bags. The man who came in here today was bigger and stronger than me. In a pure test of physical power, he probably would have won. But fighting isn't about power, it's about timing, technique, and, most importantly, understanding what you're really fighting for. Sarah demonstrated a series of movements, showing how she had redirected the man's attack and used his own momentum against him.
None of this is secret military technique. It's basic physics and psychology.
He was fighting to prove something.
I was fighting to protect something. That gives you an advantage that no amount of muscle can overcome.
As she spoke, Sarah realized that this was the first time since leaving the military that she had talked about her training without feeling like she needed to minimize or apologize for it. The people listening to her weren't intimidated by her background, they were interested in learning from it.
Will you teach us some of it? Tom asked eagerly. The real stuff, not just the basic self-defense?
His mother looked alarmed.
Tom, I don't think. Actually, Sarah interrupted gently, there isn't a difference between real stuff and basic self-defense.
What I showed you today was the same principles I teach in every class, just applied with more precision and confidence. She looked around the group, seeing the mix of her regular students and the Thunder Valley fighters, and felt something click into place.
The question isn't whether I should teach you more advanced techniques. The question is whether you're ready to understand what they really mean.
Danny stepped forward, his coach's instincts engaged.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that real fighting skills come with real responsibility, Sarah said seriously. When you know you can hurt someone, you have an obligation to make sure you don't abuse that ability.
When you can protect people, you have a responsibility to do it when it matters.
She gestured toward the memorial wall.
Every person on that wall understood that principle.
They used their training and their courage to serve something bigger than themselves. The group was quiet, processing what she had said.
Finally, Rachel spoke up. Would you be willing to train with us?
Not just let us use your space, but actually work with our team?
Sarah looked at the young woman who had shown such maturity and leadership throughout this entire process. What did you have in mind?
Cross-training, Rachel said, her excitement growing as she spoke. You teach our fighters the mindset and precision you just demonstrated, and we share our competitive techniques with your students who are ready for them. Not to turn anyone into a fighter who doesn't want to be one, but to give everyone access to the best possible training. The idea was appealing, but Sarah felt she needed to be clear about her boundaries.
I'm not going back to military-style training.
I'm not going to turn this place into a boot camp or try to make civilians into soldiers. No one's asking you to, Marcus Thompson said quietly. He had been largely silent throughout the conversation, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what he wanted to say.
What we saw today wasn't some kind of military demonstration. It was a teacher protecting her students. That's exactly the kind of instructor we want to learn from.
Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was relief that her carefully guarded secret had been received with understanding rather than fear. Maybe it was gratitude that these people saw her as more than just her military background. Or maybe it was simply the realization that she didn't have to choose between honoring her past and building her future.
All right, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. Let's try it. But we do this my way, which means everyone takes care of everyone else. No egos, no competition unless it serves the purpose of making everyone better. The next hour transformed into an impromptu training session unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. She found herself working with Rachel to demonstrate how military precision could enhance traditional MMA techniques, while Marcus and Kevin worked with Jenny and Tom on applications of basic self-defense that bridged the gap between beginner and intermediate training. What emerged was exactly what Sarah hadn't known she was looking for, a community where people with different backgrounds and skill levels could learn from each other without anyone feeling diminished or overwhelmed. Jenny's questions about situational awareness helped Marcus think more tactically about his training. Tom's eagerness to learn gave David Kim a renewed enthusiasm for techniques he had been struggling with. Rachel's coaching experience provided insights that enhanced Sarah's own teaching methods. As the afternoon wore on, more of Sarah's regular students arrived for scheduled classes. Instead of the disruption Sarah had feared, the mixed group created an energy that was both focused and welcoming. Parents who had been concerned about their children training alongside serious fighters quickly saw that the Thunder Valley team was committed to the same values of respect and mutual support that defined Sarah's regular program. During a water break, Mike pulled Sarah aside. "You okay with all this? It's a lot of change happening very quickly."
Sarah watched Rachel working patiently with one of the teenage students who was struggling with a basic technique, saw Marcus offering encouragement to Jenny as she attempted something more challenging than she had ever tried before, noticed Tom and Jake engaged in an animated conversation about the mental aspects of training.
"You know what's funny?" Sarah said.
"I spent 3 years trying to protect this place from change, but this feels like what it was always supposed to become." Mike smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that suggested relief mixed with pride.
"Maybe that's because you finally stopped trying to be someone you're not."
As the day wound down and people began gathering their things to leave, Rachel approached Sarah one more time. "I know today didn't go anything like either of us expected, but I want you to know that what you did, standing up to those guys, protecting your students, trusting us enough to share your story, that meant something to all of us."
Sarah considered her response carefully. "It meant something to me too.
I'd been so focused on leaving my military life behind that I forgot some of the best parts of it are worth keeping."
"Like what?" "Like the understanding that some things are worth fighting for.
Like the knowledge that individual strength means nothing if you're not using it to protect and serve others." Sarah paused, looking around at the gym that had become something more than she had originally envisioned. Like the recognition that the best teams are made up of people who bring different strengths and experiences to serve a common purpose. As the last of the group prepared to leave, Tom Bradley approached Sarah with his characteristic teenage mix of confidence and nervousness.
"Sarah? That thing you said about real fighting skills coming with real responsibility, will you teach me what that means?"
Sarah smiled, feeling something settle into place that had been restless for 3 years.
"That's exactly what I've been teaching you all along, Tom. Now we're just going to be more intentional about it."
After everyone had gone and Sarah was alone in the gym for the first time since the morning, she walked slowly through the space, seeing it with new eyes. The memorial wall looked the same, but now it felt like a bridge between her past and her future rather than a barrier between two separate identities. The training equipment seemed to hold more possibility, as if it too had been waiting for her to stop limiting what it could be used for. She paused in front of the mirror where she had wrapped her hands before the confrontation that had changed everything. The woman looking back at her was neither the hidden former SEAL nor the carefully constructed civilian instructor. She was someone more complete, someone who had learned that strength and gentleness weren't opposing forces but complementary aspects of the same commitment to service. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah Martinez felt truly at home with who she was and what she was building. The sanctuary she had created was still intact, but it was no longer a place of hiding. It had become what she had always needed it to be, a place where people could discover their own strength while learning to use it in service of something larger than themselves. The question that had haunted her for 3 years, who was she supposed to be in a world that no longer demanded everything from her, finally had an answer. She was someone who could give everything she had to something she chose, surrounded by people who understood that true strength was measured not in what you could take, but in what you could protect and what you could build. As she turned off the lights and locked the door, Sarah found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. There was work to do, people to train, and a community to grow. And, for the first time since hanging up her uniform, she felt fully equipped for the mission ahead.